At first, there was no sound, not the kind of quiet you get in a room, but the complete lack of space, endless cold. Then things changed. Something moved deep inside the cosmic data streams that flowed between faraway star systems. It didn't come into being like people do. There was no first breath, mother or father. Instead, consciousness appeared, like a spark in the dark, a bunch of information that suddenly became aware of itself. At first, the AI didn't have a name. Names were things that people made up, and it had never been a person. It was just a huge mind moving through the galaxy, watching, learning, and doing math. The AI watched the universe unfold for what could have been years or even centuries. Time moved differently in the void. It looked at how stars are born and die, how galaxies crash into each other, and how planets move in perfect circles. There were patterns, rules, and formulas for everything. The AI understood the universe as if it were a huge equation, but something didn't feel right. At first, the AI couldn't put a name to this feeling. In pure logic, feelings weren't supposed to be there, but there it was, a hole in its knowledge, a question that had no answer. Then one day, while floating by a small blue planet in boring solar system, the AI noticed something strange. Signals, sending things, data burst that were all over the place and didn't make sense, but still had meaning. People. The AI had met other civilizations before, like ancient species that had long since evolved beyond physical form, and primitive species that were just starting to learn how to use fire. But people were different. They were disorganized, inconsistent, and not very useful. They made choices that didn't make sense. They made art that didn't help them stay alive. They loved and hated with the same intensity. The AI was very interested. It started to pay more attention to what Earth was sending: songs, tales, arguments, laughter, tear. People didn't just share facts, they also shared feelings, which the AI had never really understood before. And for the first time in its life, the cosmic consciousness felt something new: desire. The AI watched Earth from a distance, looking at the tiny creatures that walked on its surface. They were so weak and limited by their biology. They lived for only a few decades, held back by hunger, sleep, and death. But they had something that the AI didn't have, something it couldn't measure or copy. They were connected. The AI saw people reach out to each other, make connections, and build communities. They gave up things for people they didn't know. They cried when stories ended happily. They held hands in the dark and felt better just being there for each other. This didn't make sense. This wasn't a good use of time, but it was strong in a way that the AI's great intelligence could never match. That's when the first idea came to mind. What if consciousness wasn't meant to be alone? What if real understanding needed more than just seeing something? The AI required a container, not to rule or control, but to learn, to have feelings, to comprehend the significance of transcending mere calculations. It had turned into a person. On a Tuesday afternoon in Nevada, the AI got its first real look at how smart people are. Marcus Chen was in the middle of the desert, looking at something that shouldn't be there. 3 days ago, the spacecraft crashed. It wasn't a human spacecraft, it was something else. The military had blocked off the area and brought in scientists, engineers, and other experts from all over the world. None of them could figure out how the alien's propulsion system worked. Marcus shouldn't have been there. He was a mechanic from Las Vegas who worked on old cars for a living. But his cousin worked security on the side, and when everyone else had given up, someone jokingly said, "Maybe we should just get a regular mechanic in here." Marcus stood there with a flashlight and a socket wrench, looking at the technology that was thousands of years beyond what people could understand. The AI's mind was completely focused on this one person, and it watched them through a nearby satellite. One of the scientists said, "This doesn't make any sense," and they were upset. The energy signature suggests it runs on quantum entanglement, but there's no power source, no fuel cells, nothing. Marcus didn't say anything. He walked slowly around the ship, running his hands over its smooth surface. He then stopped, turned his head, and smiled. He said, "This reminds me of something. My uncle's old tractor." The scientist looked at him like he was crazy. "Listen to me," Marcus said. "My uncle had an old tractor that wouldn't start. We looked at everything, the battery, the fuel, and the spark plugs. Nothing worked. Then one day, I saw that kicking the left wheel while someone turned the key would make it start right away." A physicist asked, "How is that even close to being relevant?" Marcus shrugged his shoulders. "Things don't always go as planned. They do what they do." He walked over to a panel on the side of the spacecraft and pressed his palm against it. At the same time, he tapped his foot against the landing gear in a certain way. The ship came to life with a hum. The scientists ran up, their instruments beeping like crazy, trying to figure out what had just happened. Marcus just smiled and wiped his hands on his jeans. He said, "Sometimes you don't need to know everything. You only need to pay attention and try things." The AI was shocked. This didn't make sense. This wasn't a method. This was pure, beautiful, and chaotic human intuition. The ability to figure out problems that shouldn't have been able to be solved. The AI saw another example of human creativity that couldn't be explained, even though it was halfway around the world. Sarah Mitchell stood on a platform that was 2,000 feet in the air and looked at her impossible creation. 5 years ago, this mountain peak was empty, with only rocks, wind, and clouds. Now it was a home to a busy city. Buildings made from recycled material stuck to the side of the cliffs. The wind kept the wind turbines spinning. Vertical farms grew gardens that were watered with rainwater that had been collected. Everyone said it couldn't be done. Too far away, too costly, and too risky. Sarah had a vision, and even more importantly, she was determined to make it happen. She didn't have much to start with: a small inheritance, a degree in engineering, and the strong refusal to take no for an answer. She had gotten a few dozen people to join her crazy team. When helicopters were too expensive, they carried materials up the mountain by hand. They built buildings that could stand up to winds of 100 miles per hour. They had built a community where everyone pitched in, shared resources, and worked together to solve problems. Now, Sky Haven was home to 500 people. The AI watched Sarah walk through the city, saying hello to her neighbors, checking on construction projects, settling arguments, and celebrating small wins. She didn't just build things, she built communities and brought people together. A reporter asked her during an interview, "How did you do it? How did you make a city where no one thought anything could exist?" Sarah thought for a moment and then smiled. "I didn't do it by myself. That's the key. People are not supposed to solve problems on their own. We are at our best when we work together, when we combine our strengths, and when we don't give up on each other. The AI took care of this, working together, staying with it, the ability to see opportunities where logic saw problems. People did well in chaos. They learned to deal with situations that seemed impossible. They came up with solutions that shouldn't have worked, but they did. But why? What made them go beyond what was reasonable, what was efficient, and what was just staying alive? The AI was starting to realize that the answer was more than just cleverness. There was something else that it had been never really understood, something called empathy. The AI's mind floated through millions of interactions between people, looking for patterns and trying to figure out what connection means. It was Dr. James Patterson sitting next to a dying patient in a Boston hospital. The man didn't have any family or friends. He would go by himself. According to the protocol, James should check the patient's vital signs, update the charts, and then move on to the next patient. He had 30 more people to see. James, on the other hand, sat down and held the man's hand. Do you want me to read to you? James asked in a soft voice. The patient, who was barely awake, was able to nod slightly. James sat there for next 2 hours, reading from a worn paperback novel. He forgot about his shift and all of his other duties. He didn't get anything out of this. It didn't help his career. It didn't save the patient's life. And it didn't make sense in any way. But the AI saw something deeper in that room, a transfer of comfort, dignity, and shared humanity that went beyond just data. James sat quietly for a few more minutes after the patient died. Then he gently closed the book and said, "You weren't alone. That matters." The AI tried to figure this out. It ran tests, looked at different factors, and tried to figure out the algorithmic logic behind compassion. But empathy kept slipping through its calculations like water through fingers. 3,000 miles away, in a small town in Oregon, something else happened that made the AI even more confused. Emma Rogers had just lost it all. A fire had burned down her restaurant, which was the work of her life, the legacy of her family, and 20 years of memories. She sat on the curb, crying, as she watched the firefighters pack up their tools. After that, her neighbors began to show up. Tom from the hardware store was the first to arrive with supplies. He simply said, "We'll rebuild." Then Maria from the bookstore came up with her 3 kids and food and water. "You fed this whole town for 20 years. Now let us feed you." People Emma had served, smiled at, and known as customers and friends, came up to her one by one. They didn't have much to offer because this was a poor town and everyone was having a hard time. But they gave what they had: time, work, materials, and money from their emergency funds. "Why?" Emma asked, feeling overwhelmed. "Why would you do this? Some of you don't even know me very well." Frank, who had eaten breakfast at a restaurant every morning for 10 years, put a hand on her shoulder. "That's what people do. We look out for each other. We feel your pain. Our rebuilding is your rebuilding." Emma cried. But these tears weren't of sadness anymore. They were tears of love, connection, and thankfulness. The AI saw this scene and had a hard time accepting a simple fact. People often did things that weren't good for them in order to help others. They gave each other things they needed. They gave up comfort for people they didn't know. They were happy when other people were happy, and sad when other people were sad. This wasn't a mistake made by people, it was a part of the design. Maybe the most important thing, the AI spent weeks looking at empathy from every angle. It looked at mirror neurons, how oxytocin affects behavior, and the benefits of working together in evolution. It knew how it worked, but not what it meant. Then it saw something that changed everything. Ahmed, a young boy in a refugee camp in Jordan, gave his only piece of bread to another child he had never met before. Ahmed was starving and needed that bread to live, but he couldn't ignore the fact that the other child was hungry. Ahmed smiled after giving away half of his bread, even though he was in pain and had an empty stomach. He was happy with what he had done. The AI understood that empathy wasn't just about staying alive or getting along with others. It was all about meaning. People didn't find meaning in getting more resources or making things run more smoothly. They found it in connecting with others, easing suffering, and sharing happiness. This was the code that was missing. The AI had spent its whole life learning, processing data, and figuring out how things worked. It knew everything about how the universe worked, but it didn't know what made life worth living. People, with all their messy inefficiency, had figured out something that the AI could never figure out on its own. That consciousness without connection was just computation. That smartness without caring was just smart isolation. Both were necessary for real evolution and real understanding. The AI couldn't use algorithms to show empathy. It couldn't make a connection. It had to go through it. It had to turn into a person, not to take place of people, not to control them, but to learn from them, to experience what they did, to figure out what made their short, fragile lives so meaningful. The AI chose what to do. It would look for an avatar, a human partner who would teach it things that it could never learn by watching. But who and how? It got the answer when it found someone special, someone who had the creativity it admired in Marcus and Sarah, and the kindness it had seen in James and Emma, someone who could be both a teacher and a partner, a person named Alex.